Hello and welcome back to another episode of Three Knees Down. This is the Bidalot RS series. So in this episode we're going to be building the engine for the Bidalot RS replica that I have. And this replica is the replica of the steel frame Bidalot RS, which was made in the 90s. Bidalot is a French company which manufactures a lot of scooter and small displacement motorcycle parts, aftermarket parts for racing. So it features a parallelogram style single variated engine, so it's a CVT much like the MBK51, except that it's parallelogram, so two pivot points as opposed to one. The frame itself I got imported from France from a builder whose name I don't know, I only know him online, but it was fairly well put together. The dimensions are approximately the same as the original Bidalot RS frame, but there's a few modifications, such as a monoshock through the frame, an option for dual shocks in the back, and the gas tank is also built into the frame, which is that boxy looking section right on the right side. So let's just get started on the actual engine build, and if you want to see more about the frame, I'll make a separate video for that, talking in detail about what the frame is and the dimensions and more about the history of the RS. So let's get started on the engine build. Alright, so before we set up our crankshaft to be centered inside of the cases, one thing that we have to remember and be cognizant of is everything that's going to be put into the cases has to be put into the cases when you're doing measurements. So what that means is, normally when you test the width of the crankshaft on the inside, use a gauge here. You want to make sure that when you're measuring that you're using the same gasket that you're going to be putting in, and that it's pressed in at the exact torque that you'll be using on the engine. Otherwise, your measurements will be off a little bit, and it's going to cause you some problems, especially with these radial bearings, which need to be put in so that way no play is present. So the Bidalot engine didn't come with a gasket for the cylinder, so we're going to cut our own gasket paper. And if you've never cut your own gasket paper before, it's just as simple as making sure the engine case halve is flat. Luckily, the Bidalot case halves are pretty much exactly the same, so we just make a tracing of it and we'll cut it out with an X-Acto knife. When you're tracing, be sure to be as accurate as you can against the cases themselves. And once you go through and actually cut it, leave lots of space on the gasket paper. This will help you later on when you actually precision cut it. So it might be a little bit difficult to see, but here's the outline of the outside of the engine cases. Alright, now I usually take something sharp and make sure that I've lined everything up as it was from the outside. You could do this before you cut, actually, sort of skip the step here. And I just twist on the inside of where every bolt is going to be. Screwdriver works, or something pointy works even better. So once you have all of your markings marked down, just go through with an X-Acto knife and X mark the spot style, cut open the holes, or use a hole puncher. So now we can take these and put the engine bolts inside. Alright, so I've cut out part of the dowel pin area so that way we can put in one of the dowel pins and get this lined up and centered. Also put in 2 of the engine case bolts, and I'm now going to cut out the rest of the area where all of the both the dowel pin and the case bolts go through, so that way I can get a more exact cut, and then I'll come back and exact cut these 2. Alright, so all the holes are made, and as you can see, if you've done this yourself, you may notice that the lines may not match up 100% to where you outlined it, which is why we left this much material on the outside, and it will make it a lot easier so that when we cut the inside here, we can just go back and trim the outside and it'll be perfectly matched. So to do the inside part, make sure that you have your bolts in so that way the gasket doesn't move, and that your gasket isn't floppy around, it's nice and taut against everything. And one way of doing this is taking a coin or something and rubbing the inside part, so that way you can get a clear edge of the outline of the engine case, so that way when you're cutting it, you don't make a mistake, and it'll be a little bit easier to see the edge of the inside of the cases. You don't have to be super exact, but just be careful when you're doing it so that way you don't rip through the gasket paper and then you got to start all over. So just be a little bit gentle as you're doing the inside rubbing. So here we can see the outline of the intake area nice and sharp. And we'll do the inside of the next part. So we have a good outline, clear indication of the inside of the case. So I'm going to cut from here, and again leave some additional gasket paper so that way we can make a better judgment as to how exact we need to cut into the case. And for the intake side, you want to leave a good lip so that way when you're cutting in, this little piece here, because this piece is going to be floating by itself, this piece will at least be attached to the cylinder. I'm going to leave some gasket paper here, about this much, and this much here on the top, so that way it's just not floating away. Alright, so now we have a good, clear inside understanding of where we're cutting, and we're now going to make the more precise, inline, exact cut for the gasket paper. One thing to note, remember that when you're cutting against the aluminum, always be careful as to what you're cutting. You don't want to cut off bits and pieces of the aluminum off, so just be careful as you're going around and making your sharp edges on the gasket paper. Here is the more or less completed internal cut, and this is nice and smooth on every part that it needs to be. I'll probably go up and clean up some of these areas, and when we get to pressing the cases together, I will cut off these extra pieces. So now that we're done, we're going to get the engine cases together on the vise, and we're going to measure the distance that we need to do for the crankshaft. So if you haven't already noticed, the E20 bearings that I'm using are radial style cage bearings, which allow you to take off the actual cage. So in order for us to have everything set up, the actual cages need to be installed first, so that way we can figure out the actual spacing and alignment for the crankshaft. So it's just a matter of pounding them in, using some heat, and getting them in place. I found that pushing them all the way in, I didn't have enough spacer to use for alignment, so I just put them flush against the case in this build. Now that we've had our gasket cut out and everything's all measured, what we need to do is find the distance where we need to put the crankshaft inside of the cases, so that way the crankshaft is centered inside of the cases. As I said before, sometimes people forget that when you need to center the cases, or center the crankshaft, you need to do that with everything that's going to be assembled with the cases. So that includes the gasket and any other kind of spacers or bearings or whatever that's going to be inside of the cases. Otherwise, if you just measure the cases by themselves, you're not going to get it truly accurate. So first we need to know how much distance is, how thick this gasket is. I already know because I've measured it out and I purchased it specifically for this, but it's 0.3 millimeters. So simple 0.3 millimeters. It's reading a little bit under 0.3, but that's okay. It's around 2.8 to 3 millimeters, or 0.28 to 0.3 millimeters. And we have our gasket installed. We have our dowel pins inside. Something that you may want to be aware with if you have Bidalot cases, or even just any cases that are aftermarket, if you're finding that the dowel pins don't go in so easily, these had to get the surface on the inside here machined out just a little bit so these could fit in. Otherwise, they would just press in and it was impossible to get apart. So make sure that your dowel pins flow freely. You can use some WD-40 or two-stroke oil or whatever you have at hand to make sure that they slide in and out just fine, and that they still don't move at all. So we have this in, and now we can press it together with the spacer, or not the spacers, the bolts. I'm just gonna do 4 to get the general idea. Alright, so this is nice and tight. And what you want to do now, in order to measure the inside, we're going to measure where the bearing sits flush with the case. And in order to do that, you need self-centering gauges. And I got these for really cheap on eBay. It's not that fancy of a part, but this is what they look like. They're just T gauges. So they squish in like this, and you can turn this screw in so that way it stays in place. Simple as that. And let it go and they'll open up. So you want to get it on the inside and get the center point down here Here, I'll zoom in so we can see that more clearly. Make sure we're focused in. So we have the center here, and I'm going to tighten it. Gotta put it back in. Alright, so I'm tightening it just enough so that way the gauge itself can move and squish itself inside and be more accurate. And let's make sure we're correctly focused here. There we go. So now you wiggle it just like this, so that way you can get the thickest point, more or less. So this is what I'm ending up with here. So now we take our calipers and make sure we're zeroed and just put it in. So we're at 40.79. That's what we're ending up with. So that's with the gasket. So if we subtract 3.3 from that, we have 40.49 or 40.5. We can round up there. Alright, so we have our distance where we need to set the crankshaft. Now what we need to do next is actually know what the width of the crankshaft is. So that's just a simple measurement here. Make sure we're zeroed out. And we're at 38.63. So we'll write this down so we do not forget. Our crankshaft difference, or width, internal width, is 40.79, and our the crankcase is 40.79 internally, and our crankshaft body is 38.6. Alright, so what we do with these numbers is we're going to find how much space needs to be on either side of here, so that way the crankshaft is perfectly centered to the cases and has even space, equal space on either side. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but you want to make sure that you have as much space even on both sides, so that way the crankshaft rod is centered, the piston is centered, and you're not having your crankshaft body scraping along the side of the case, because that would be bad. So if we subtract these two numbers, we get 2.16 millimeters. Now we divide that by 2 because this will be on both sides, and that's 1.8 millimeters. So we have 1.8 millimeters on both sides that we're allowed to have. So with that, there's one final step. These bearings, they don't press fit in, so it makes it very easy for us to slide them in and out and add in spacers. Because the way that these bearings work,
they just fall right out when the cases come apart. So we need to make sure that the crankshaft is within 0.05 millimeters. And how we're going to do that is using a dial gauge in a second. So we will have 0.05 millimeters maximum play on this axis right here. And we will use these spacers. So let's move to the dial indicator bench, and we're going to seat the crankshaft inside for the first time and take measurements and make sure that the crankshaft is correctly aligned.
So here's the actual setup that I'm using for the alignment of the crankshaft. The micrometer is secured to the vise, which is all secured to the bench. And what I'm doing here is moving the crankshaft in and out to find the minute play that's going on. So the micrometer measures in thousandths of a millimeter, and we want to get it in between one tick on each side. So it's just a lot of trial and error, checking out the spacers and making sure that the crankshaft is still aligned. So here you can see what it would look like when it's pretty much perfect. It's within 0.005 millimeters. It's kind of hard because the play between the vise and the crankshaft is not 100% accurate. So once we figure that out, we just press in our Viton seals. I'm doing this from the outside this time because it's how most of the people have installed them for these cases.
If you want to see that the crankshaft is actually centered, remember we have 1.08 millimeters on each side. So I have a 1 millimeter gauge and a 0.1 millimeter gauge. So I'm going to put them together, and we're just going to slip it in on both sides of the crankshaft. So that fits in there, barely. And this fits in here, barely. So it's pretty much perfectly centered, as long as we have 1 millimeter. So 1 millimeter slides in perfectly fine on both sides. We're all set. So now the next step is putting on the cylinder, and we have these pins. Now what these pins do, you can use them in a couple different ways. You can have the pin set on this part of the cylinder right here in the center, and this means that you have aligned the top of your head, so that way there's no side-to-side play, and it's always perfectly right there, centered exactly where you lined it up to be. But I'm not going to be using it for that anyway. I'm going to be using these pins right here on the cases themselves, and this keeps the cylinder centered on the case. So there's no side-to-side play, and the transfers that we match from the cylinder onto the case are always matched with the cylinder. Another way you can do that without having to drill a hole into the cylinder and to the cases and possibly making a mess of everything if you're not very good with machinery, you can just get spacers which slot into the cylinder and are in between the cylinder and the stud.
But we're not going to be using spacers this time around, just the actual pins. So I just went out and sort of guesstimated where I wanted the pins to be, as long as they were still inside of the case, the amount of case that I have and the amount of cylinder that I have, and enough space for me to heat it up, get a pliers and hammer and just sort of tap it in there, keep it in place. Since the pins actually measure 2.5 millimeters wide, I used a 2.4 millimeter drill bit and just pressed it in and made sure that it was all nice and straight. So there's the finished product right there, and we had to do one for the other side. The final step is getting the actual gasket paper cut out for our cylinder. So this is just a matter of trial and error, and I try to keep it as exact as I possibly can for the cylinder itself. So I just cut a hole and keep trimming and trimming and trimming till it fits right through. So just lots of excess gasket paper being trimmed off in the middle after I start it this way. You may wonder why I'm not using the stock gasket paper, and that's because it's not a 100% match to the actual cylinder. It's a little bit wider in some parts and it's a little bit smaller in some areas, so I could cut it out, but it would always not be a perfect case match. So we want it to be perfect, so that way when we actually do the case matching, we know exactly where the transfers on the cylinder lies, and it will always match up to the cases 100%. So luckily with the pins, it makes this process a lot easier to do, and you end up with a product like this once you cut the actual transfers out. So precision cut, again, same principles as cutting the gasket paper for the cases. So that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. In the next episode we will go through and actually do the case match and case cleanup. So thanks for watching, and see you guys next time.